Good morning and welcome to another episode of OT Investigates. However, it is not just me here today. I've brought along my fellow detectives. Oh Christ, that sounded lame as fuck. I'm joined today by Onod
Hello.
and the Mayor.
Hello.
Today we're going to be talking about. Well, Onod, what are we talking about? You have the title of the video.
We're going to be talking about the environmental policies of wargaming companies, mostly Games Workshop.
Get your pillows and your nightcaps ready.
Like and
It is.
subscribe.
It's a very interesting topic.
It's very on brand. Did anything in particular provoke you to do this, or was it just your deep concern for the environment and the future of our planet?
As an end, it was my deep concern for the environment and the planet. But there was a couple of reasons for this. One, it was a vague memory that was jogged about a month ago of Games Workshop saying that they were trialing recycling sprues, and I was like, "Oh yeah, they said that, didn't they? Like over a year ago." And I haven't really heard anything about that, and sort of interested. And then when their yearly report came out, there was quite a lot on environmental stuff, and I thought it'd just be interesting to kind of look at what they're doing and what I guess their competitors are doing, and just sort of discuss whether or not wargaming is a very environmentally sustainable thing, given that what we mainly use is a plastic.
So first thing we're going to talk about is specifically focusing in on the GW side of things. We'll come on to other companies later on. I think actually worth noting at this point, one of the things that does go in GW's favour is that they do seem to be more organised and transparent about this than lots of other companies. And like, while the data that they are showing isn't all like strictly positive, at least we do have access to that data through their financial reports.
Yeah, and I think it's probably fair to say that anything we do say here from my research, I just want to preface the whole video by saying Games Workshop is definitely moving in the right direction and is definitely, from what I can tell, much more advanced than a lot of their rivals, I would say.
Mainly in terms of like the structures they seem to have in place, right? Like they actually have like, you know, not only a single committee but a subcommittee looking at carbon management, which is an excellent example of corporate delegation. But
yeah, I mean, we'll get onto this later, but we don't really know what other companies are doing, so they might have a similar thing, but they aren't publicly saying it. And I would imagine in 2024 that as the company, if you were doing something about the environment, you probably would want people to be aware of that.
Yeah. So if you're not advertising it,
yeah,
potentially problematic. But this is getting into the sort of slightly libelous territory. So maybe we should leave it there.
Very much so. Should we talk about the carbon emissions?
Yes.
Of Games Workshop.
Yeah. So, in very, very simple terms, in 2024, their overall carbon emissions were slightly higher than they were in 2023. There are some categories that weren't included in 2023 that were included in 2024. So that may cause things to actually be slightly biased towards 2023 versus 2024. They've basically been split into three different scopes, scopes 1, 2, and 3. Scopes 1 and 2 seem to be to do with their like own usage, as it were. So like in the production of things.
Yeah, essentially. Then scope 3 is to do essentially with transport mostly. And they do also include things like business travel and stuff in scope 3. But that's essentially the main areas, yeah.
One thing they've highlighted here is how big the jump has been in their use of like air freight and and I'm trying to think of like whole world reasons as to why that might be the case. I mean, I guess they're probably using less shipping.
So they claim in their report that this is down to shipping problems rather than a decision they wanted to take. They basically said, look, to get products to certain places in the world where we needed to get them, we had to resort to this. We didn't really want to. I think it's probably more expensive for them as a company as well, but they just kind of went like that. We had to do this, and I think this kind of matches what we've been seeing with like certain products being like delayed in like Australia, for example. Sometimes they say, "Oh, by the way, this is coming out 2 weeks later in Australia." I think this is really just kind of following that trend of we already knew this information. But like, blimey, once you get the data, they really were having to rely a lot on air compared to the previous year.
Yeah, and in terms of like, their production stuff seems to have stayed relatively stable as far as I can tell. I mean, I presume actually as they scale up, it becomes harder to keep their carbon footprint low, because how far away are they from opening up their new warehouse? I can't remember. Or has that already happened?
They have already opened up their new warehouse. I think they're currently also expanding factory production as well. I think essentially what we're seeing with factory emissions is they are maxing out their warehouse and factory basically. Yeah. So the reason there isn't much change is because what they are maxing it, and we're not going to see a dramatic drop because they're not going to be turning off the machines making all the product anytime soon.
I'm surprised that actually the amount of emissions they're creating from their own manufacture is as low as it is compared to a lot of the other categories. Like overall, Scope 3 is absolutely ginormous.
Yeah, which I guess we should also probably bear in mind that Scope 3 is going to include transport of production and goods that they don't produce. So books, for example, paints, paintbrushes, all of their scenery that was made in China, or at least a lot of it was until recently, and other things like that. That's all going to be factored in, whilst obviously the emissions from producing stuff is just purely, I
mean, the purchased goods and services, which I think is the category you're talking about, is it? The purchased goods and services?
Yeah.
That's 2/3 of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Which I guess is why maybe partially they're bringing stuff in-house. Like, I think that they are ceasing to use China as much and starting to try and produce more stuff themselves, just because I guess it's just not economically viable as much as it's not.
It's more profitable as well. If you can do it in-house, generally you want to do it in-house. You're cutting out the middleman, as it were.
So they have identified, and they are, in the report, they admitted that they were slightly disappointed about greenhouse gas emissions increasing from last year by 9%, but they think that that's a short-term thing. And as we see, their target, which very conveniently excludes Scope 3, which is their main producer, their target is to reduce Scope 1 and 2. And I guess that does make sense because those are the ones which they're directly in control of, whilst they're not necessarily as in control of the third-party stuff. They are aiming then to reduce their CO2 emissions by 55% by 2032, which I guess is quite a good aim. They're going to have to do a hell of a lot of work, and I guess we can discuss some of the stuff that they're doing to sort of tackle that in a little bit. But we'll move on now to the next part, which is I think the main thing really that I got from doing the research is that, and I guess it makes sense to the business, Games Workshop's main issue with climate change is the risks that they have seen it pose to their business, and they're mostly interested really in tackling it because of the risks. And if you actually look at what they identify as risks, they have essentially got 7 main risks identified which they have linked to climate change, and they have a sustainability steering group.
Wow.
With
who comes up with the names? That's what I want to know.
The subcommittee, the Carbon Management Steering Group, who are responsible for meeting and discussing and setting targets. And the interesting thing is that in the long term, which is 3+ years, in the long term, they are viewing most of this as very high. high risk. So Games Workshop are viewing things like extreme weather as being extremely problematic to them. They are viewing sort of access to resources as well as problematic, which does make sense given that their business relies on fossil fuels for the production of what they sell. So they are taking this very seriously, and they are working on doing this essentially. Things that they have started to do then in order to tackle these risks. They say that when they have been building their new factories and warehouse things, they have been future-proofing against extreme weather. Now, I don't know what that actually means if they're building stuff in the UK, whether that just means like they've got aircon in them.
It's quite vague, isn't it?
Yeah. But I'm guessing if like they're also building stuff in the US, it might be a bit more serious, kind of like, are they future-proofing for hurricanes? It's hurricanes in the Atlantic. And that sort of stuff. But yeah, they have said that they're doing that. It's vague, but they've taken it into account. And then interestingly, for planning of retail operations, they've identified carbon pricing, supply chain disruption, and competition as a risk. And the reason why competition is a risk is because Games Workshop have basically suggested that if certain markets are no longer open to them because of transport costs, other companies will fill the void, or counterfeiting will fill the void. I would maybe say that the reason why counterfeiting would replace them is more to do with pricing than them not being able to supply. I think that they're quite good at supplying places. It's just they're so expensive. But I can see a logic there, I suppose.
Well, I mean, if your transport costs are higher, your product costs are higher, right? Which makes it easier for you to be undercut by 3D printers or whatever.
Yeah. But the final thing that they are considering quite seriously is their R&D, and they here talking about their access to resources and their customer expectations. And they're basically saying, you know, all of these young people who are hoping to recruit to the company, they're probably actually going to be pissed off about us if we don't do something about this. And they're probably going to be less willing to buy plastic crap if we don't look at stuff. And they didn't talk about this in the report, but from separate things they said, and this all sort of link into what they're actually doing, which I guess we can sort of link onto nicely now. They are actually taking quite a few steps in order to address stuff like this. So if we move on to what they're doing, they're trying to be more sustainable with their products. Now, I think this is probably where the most discussion is going. We'll talk about in a second. They're claiming that we make miniatures which most people don't throw away, you know? There are still miniatures floating around from Games Workshop when they originally made them, all the way back in like the 80s. And that is true. And I think most miniatures that Games Workshop produce probably end up in like an attic rather than landfill. However, they don't really address the fact that, one, there's no real endorsed Games Workshop secondhand market. So it's all very well and good saying, yes, we are not contributing to landfill, but equally you are pumping out more and more plastic year on year. And like that is bad because it requires fossil fuels to make. The other thing which they've chosen to ignore is, yes, their miniatures are incredibly sustainable if you're thinking about it in that landfill terms. Their books aren't. Their book model is basically
Disgusting.
We invalidate a very, very expensive, large, you know, glossy, inky, hardback book every 3 years, and you have to replace it. And these are not books which I think that people are hanging on to in maybe the same way they would have done 10, 20 years ago, because 40k books, a lot of the time, The only thing that changes in them is the rules. The law and the art is more or less the same. So they're not really incentivizing people to keep those products in the way that they're claiming that they are. And I think that's because Games Workshop sees themselves as a miniatures company, not as a book company. But the books are a big part of it for those who play the game. Could they be moving away from a book model? And I think that if they are serious about sustainability, the answer is yes, they absolutely could be. But as we know, they're a business and they want profits. Books make them presumably lots of money. So I would push back on them there and say that that is actually something that they probably should.
What I would say is, as someone who has bought are they called EPUBs or something? The digital book versions.
The ebooks, sure.
The ebooks. I think that, from my point of view, is a good way to go. More and more people having access to devices, and if they were to provide a bit more support on those, they're not the best things in the world, and I think if they were paying a bit more attention to them, their Games Workshop, they could make, is there a Black Library app or something? I don't know.
They have rules apps.
They have rules apps.
The way that they make the rules apps, and this is the thing, they're not incentivizing to do this. The way the rules apps work is you need to buy the book and then scan a QR code. Right. They need to, and also, you're right, ebooks are available. Most people probably don't go for them for the simple reason that, one, a lot of people like the hard copy. That's fine, consumer choice. But two, they don't really make them any cheaper. And
I think that's what I was going to say. But they can. I don't personally mind paying that extra because instead of going to a game where I have loads of books, I can just.
I think a lot of people do. I think a lot of people, if you're asking them to spend £30, they're going, well, if I'm going to spend £30, I'd rather get a nice hard copy book than a PDF.
I suppose if they were, if GW cut out what would be their perceived costs on, the book, you're right, it shouldn't be the same price. If they're trying to incentivize it, which is fully within their control, they've got nothing to lose by selling it at a lower cost.
Yeah, well, they're trying to incentivize you buying the book. Basically, they don't want to not sell their books, and I think it should be the other way around. If they're really
serious
about sustainability.
Yeah.
The other thing that they said, they're reducing single-use plastic. Great. Packaging, for example, they're trying to look for sustainable paper and card options. I do think that there is a bit of a arbitrary. Sometimes when you buy a Games Workshop product, there's no plastic packaging. Sometimes there's a random plastic holder for the screw, and it's why have they done this? So great, get rid of all of that. It's pointless. It doesn't do anything. And if you think it makes it a more premium product, you're wrong. So they're saying that they're trying to get rid of that. Good. You introduced it yourselves. You didn't used to do that. So.
Well done, us. We've done it, guys.
You're getting rid of something that you didn't do 10 years ago. So, good job. In recycling, now this is actually really, really interesting. As somebody who doesn't actually ever go to a Games Workshop store, I haven't witnessed this yet. But back in March of 2023, they introduced a recycling bin where you can take used screws, there you go, and paint pots. Now, the data on this is actually sounds quite impressive. Since they've started that, they have recycled 8.5 tons of plastic just through those bins. And presumably recycling stuff from Warhammer World when they print a sprue that they don't need, they recycle it now. That does sound good. Now, I don't know. We're never going to get data on what proportion of sprues that actually is, because that could be 1% of sprues. Yeah. But at least it sounds good. And
at least it's something.
Yeah, it's something. And I think what would be nice to see from Games Workshop is, why don't they provide those bins to a friendly local gaming store and collect?
They don't want to be directly associated with them, do they?
No, they do. They
just take their recycled stuff.
They want them to sell their products, right? And I think it would be nice to, if they are really serious about like creating this positive image, I feel like that's a fairly easy thing for Games
It's an easy
Workshop
win, isn't it?
to do as a win, isn't it? What they did also say when they announced this scheme in 2023, they did also mention that Games Workshop are also trying to find a way of using old sprues to recycle and put back into their product. So there is a hypothetical that at some point they can actually recycle in-house, which would be great. But at the moment, that's not the case. It goes towards making other plastic products. That's good. I think that it would be nice to see them roll that out further, but great. They've been working on making their own operations more sustainable. The flagship thing
it's a fantastically vague sentence there, isn't it? On sustainable operation. Literally doesn't mean anything.
I think they just used ChatGPT for this.
The flagship thing that they've done for this is they are getting more solar panels onto their factory, and they are now producing 7% of their own electricity, which is good. I imagine it's also good. I imagine it's also good from the fact that, like, I think that the Nottingham energy resources struggle to actually fuel Games Workshop.
Wow!
So I think it's good just to make sure that they actually have enough
Games
energy.
Workshop is draining the Midlands.
It literally is. I think that they literally would need to upgrade the the entire network if they were going to try and increase the factory in that location.
Yeah. Wow! So they've just done it themselves.
So they produce their own energy, which is good. And they've also made some vague stuff about in their new factory they're going to be incorporating renewables, etc. Very vague. Yeah. And then they've also said that they're aiming, again, vague, have a much more granular understanding of waste we are generating, why it is being generated, and how that could be better managed. They want to minimize the amount.
Literally is meaningless.
Minimize the amount of operational waste that's being generated. It's unavoidable, ensured is reused, recycled.
Yeah. Unless they have like a concrete,
they have one
actual target, I feel like these sentences are meaningless because
they
also
have like one concrete policy, which is that they're going to plastic bags from their retail stores.
Right. Okay. Which is what's being encouraged anyway. So like, I mean, it should be noted, right? Like, virtually all companies will be having to do something like this anyway. Obviously, I think like GW seem to have more of a structure than like a lot of other companies do. But like, I think all of these things are part of the way the world is going anyway. So they'd be foolish if they weren't doing it.
Yeah, and this is kind of like all of the information released to date that I was able to find that's noteworthy enough to talk about. I think that basically they are making the right moves, they're doing the right things. They are certainly more driven by their own personal profit, I would argue, than anything else. And the fact that they've said to investors quite cynically, hey, young people are bothered about this and they're not going to buy from us, so we probably should do it so they buy from us, right? That's fine. They're a business. I get it. That's the way that the free market works. What we probably should do to put this into a bit of comparison perspective, other manufacturers. Now, I went through a few what I perceive as kind of like reasonably large manufacturers, some from the UK, some not, just to try and get an idea. It is very, very difficult to actually find any information. So for Warlord Games, who I think it's difficult to find exact data, but they're roughly the second biggest in the UK after Games Workshop in terms of like just raw profit. They have nothing on their website talking about any kind of policy. They don't mention it at all in their annual reports. They're not a company which is on the stock market like Games Workshop. So their annual reports are basically just there for tax reasons. So they don't go into as much detail because it isn't a stockholders report, but there's no kind of mention of it at all. And I can't find any interviews where people have asked the people who run Warlord Games about this either. So it doesn't really seem to have ever come up. Exactly the same for Mantic Games, who again, another UK company. There is nothing on their website, nothing they've really said that I could find. And then for another reasonably, that kind of like middle-sized company, this will know from New Zealand, Battlefront Miniatures, who make like Flames of War and all that sort of stuff. Again, nothing I could find there. And I know that Battlefront Miniatures don't actually produce their own stuff. They have factories in Asia. So they presumably are actually potentially having to import stuff a lot more than those UK-based companies, because the UK is one of the biggest miniatures markets. So if you can produce your stuff in the UK, you are presumably doing better environmentally than not, is my oversimplified way of thinking about it. One company that I was able to find information for, Atomic Mass Games, but not really specifics about them. But because they are owned by Asmodee, and Asmodee actually publish information, I was able to get a little bit of info from them. So Asmodee, who were recently, up until recently, part of the Embracer Group, they were required to set sustainability goals. So we know that they definitely did set goals. Yeah. And there is a pledge to reduce carbon emissions by 45% by 2030, which is roughly the same as Games Workshop's overall pledge. Now, because that's Asmodee's pledge, not AMG's, Asmodee might make all of those reductions in a completely different area of their business. So we don't know whether AMG will directly do it, but we know Asmodee, who do board games and that sort of thing, are. They are working on obviously doing this sort of stuff. The only other company which I was able to find any data on was Hornby, who obviously are very big if we take model trains as part of the same hobby that we're in, although debatable.
We use their terrain sometime, it's fine, we'll allow it.
But Hornby do actually own Airfix, and that is significantly closer. Now, Hornby is really interesting because I was able to find two bits of data on Hornby. One is that in 2014, they did actually make improvements to their warehouse to reduce energy wastage. But based on the article, I think this was more due to the fact that somebody realized that like some of their electrical systems were like 50 years old, rather than that they were particularly doing it deliberately to help the environment. The other really interesting thing, though, about Hornby is because they are actually a company that you can buy stocks in like Games Workshop, they also produce a massive financial report. They have absolutely no mention of climate change and do not identify it as a risk.
That's fucking wild. That is mad. Like
they identify things like supply chain issues, but they don't connect it to the issue of climate change.
Like, if you are even like, I mean, should we say GW is what, like a small to medium sized company, maybe? Like, and in the grand scheme of like the world, it's probably quite a small company. But like even on a very cynical level, if you are just thinking about your business and you don't care at all about the environment, I feel like you have to be considering the effects that it's going to have. Like, because unless, I guess, you're looking purely at the UK as like an isolated case, as soon as you have to like export anywhere, like immediately climate change will become a relevant question, because like things like air freight and shipping are just going to get more expensive. So that's utterly bizarre to me.
It seems the way though that Hornby is addressing that those expenses linking to supply chains are the risk, and that it's not part of a wider risk, right? It's not that they're not aware of what you've just said. It's just that they don't directly, like Games Workshop does, break it down into this is an environmental and sustainability risk. They just say, hey, it's costing us more to ship model trains to Japan.
Yeah.
So we need to factor that into our profits.
Yeah.
What I do think is really interesting about this, though, is just thinking about the reasoning behind that. Is this because Games Workshop has a more modern sort of executive board? Quite possibly. I mean, I don't really know much about Hornby, but I can't imagine they are that cutting edge. That's obviously a stereotype. But
also, like, if we stereotype their customers, right?
Well,
like,
yeah, that's what I was going to say.
If I was to throw a completely uneducated guess out there, my guess would be that the average age of a
lot higher
Warhammer, like I'd put a Hornby collector 10 to 15 years on average, at least, older than.
I would say more like 20 to 30.
Yeah, but there are some young people who are into trains, and that should be allowed.
I think if you're taking an average, I think that Warhammer targets teenagers to 20-year-olds, and I think Hornby targets people from their 40s to their 60s. And I do wonder whether it is just a case of them going, our customer base on average are not as fussed about this, and so it's not as big an issue. Now, having said all of that, and this is kind of the end of the video, I just wanted to obviously a company which is not really comparable at all of how massive it is, but just because they are working in roughly the same area, which is producing plastic toys, just to kind of maybe give a perspective of, what Games Workshop's doing sounds great, but other companies are taking this way more seriously, and that is Lego. And I think it's fair to say that to take it more seriously than Games Workshop in terms
probably
of
make a lot more stuff with plastic though as well.
There is that as well. Games Workshop obviously have made a few sort of targets. Lego's targets are quite a lot more, what was the word? Ambitious, and substantial as well. Now some of them are vague, and I haven't gone through like as much detail because Lego, unlike everyone else that we talked about, they actually have on their website a page dedicated to this. And because the video is not really about Lego, I just grabbed that info rather than going through their financial reports. Because I'm not going to lie, I went through quite a lot of financial reports for this video, and they're quite boring.
Whoa!
And particularly for the companies who don't actually do anything about the environment, having to go through the reports to not find anything was also depressing. So Lego are working on sustainable materials and packaging, just like all of the other stuff. What Lego are doing, though, which is really interesting, is they're trying to make what they're calling more circular products and packaging, and exploring new business models. So they're actually trying to look at a way of creating business models which aren't requiring as much stuff. And something else they're doing, which is really, really interesting, something that they calling Lego Replay, which is providing consumers the chance to pass on their Lego bricks. And Lego is actually facilitating this. So Lego is basically actively encouraging people to give away their Lego to other people rather than buy more Lego. Now, I don't know exactly how this scheme works. Hello, Future Onod here whilst editing. I actually did a little bit of digging into what Lego Replay actually does, and it kind of invalidated what we ended up talking about. My bad, should have probably done that before the recording. I'm just going to very quickly replace the discussion with a brief summary. Essentially, the way that Lego Replay works is you donate your Lego, and then they're working with charities, but also with certain schools that sign up for the project and other kind of educational sort of institutions in whatever countries that they're doing it in. And they are literally just giving bricks to these places. So they are gonna, take all of the 8 stud bricks, for example, shove them in a box, and then they just hand it over. And you're not going to get like a full Lego set. So if you were to, donate like a Millennium Falcon, they're not going to just hand over a Millennium Falcon to the school. but they are going to hand over loads of blocks so that they can be used for the kind of original purpose of Lego, the kind of more imaginative building sort of thing. So yeah, really interesting to see from a company like Lego. And I guess the takeaway from me would be, is this something, that Games Workshop could be doing? Could they be saying, hey, if you brought a box set with a load of sprues that you then never built and you're never going to build, hey, maybe we will take those off you. Maybe we'll give you, some paint pots or a voucher to spend in store so that, you have something for it perhaps. And then they use them to give to people just starting the hobby as a way to hook in. So, there is stuff that it can be done. I guess it's sort of up to the business to decide whether it's worth it. But clearly Lego does feel like this is worth doing. So there we go. Back to the recording. They are being much more ambitious with their renewable energy stuff. So they're actually aiming to try and be carbon neutral. So they want to eliminate CO2's impact from making, transporting, and selling Lego products. So they're not
the transporting is nuts. Like,
yeah,
the amount of stock they must have to shift. Like, unless they're using like all electric vehicles or something, and like carbon.
Well, I don't know.
That must be nuts.
I don't know the details, but that's very ambitious compared to Games Workshop, who are limiting it only to production and their retail. And Games
and a
Workshop
lot of their emissions come from transporting their shit.
And they're only trying to reduce that by 50%, not actually 100%. They're also aiming for zero waste from any Lego factory, office, or owned and operated store. So nothing to landfill.
Wow. How is that possible? Surely that can't.
I don't know.
Is it a case of, to some extent, you can almost like pay to have it offset?
Yeah.
So presumably there's going to be a fair amount of that, at least to begin with.
There is definitely going to be a lot of that to begin with, and that is actually one of the major issues with first world countries and this, because a lot of companies are doing that, and it doesn't actually mean anything. Because you just spend a load of money, someone in a different part of the world takes your money, and it's then offset. But whether that actually results in less carbon emissions is debatable. But yeah, I final bit of the video. Games Workshop have just outright said that it's basically up to consumers if they're going to do more, because one of the main factors driving them is whether we care. Yeah. So basically,
how do we tell them we care?
By liking and subscribing.
There it is.
No, I guess give plastic to their bins, right?
Yeah, feed the bins.
Feed the bins.
It's crazy, right? That like a company that is as profit focused as they are is. I mean, I'm not saying they're being completely disingenuous, but they're being like clearly pushed and like motivated substantially by the fact that in some ways being more environmentally conscious makes you more money, which like is super interesting, because like that is, in my head at least, that's not normally how it works. Like normally companies that are actively striving to be more environmentally sustainable pay like a cost basically in efficiency, but like the fact that maybe consumers are now motivated more by like the brand image of a company like Lego, for instance, like if you know they're trying to be more sustainable, I assume that would make
you buy their toys.
Shop there.
Yeah, I think it is a brand image thing, and I think that it's Games Workshop increasingly want to be viewed as a luxury brand.
Yeah,
they want you to think they're the best of the best, and so therefore they also want to act like they're the best of the best.
I do wonder
the perception of them to be, this is the company that is cutting edge.
Also, for like, if parents say are buying their kids a toy or something, like often they won't really know what's going on, but if they perceive a company for whatever reason as being more environmentally sustainable, like Lego, for instance, again, like that's got to be a huge motivating factor, because maybe they don't know whether the toy is something the kid wants or not, but if they know that like there's it's being done in a sustainable way, and they're hitting net zero and things like that. Yeah, super interesting.
It's interesting because I sort of didn't mention this because it's like Games Workshop from 15 years ago, but we'll add it as a sort of postscript. Like anecdotally, people who used to work at Games Workshop have given interviews where they basically said 15 years ago, when stuff wasn't selling, they literally just binned it. So like when they made the box set Dreadfleet, which sold really, really poorly, they had a load of boxes left over. And rather than letting them take up warehouse space and sell them slowly, they literally just compacted it all and put it into landfill.
That's wild.
And
I mean, yeah. Wow.
So
I
like,
I definitely believe it. Like I'm fully prepared to believe that happened.
You may be willing to, drop 50 quid on your box of Space Marines and get your 5 Space Marines, but Games Workshop are pretty happy to just chuck that in the bin because it's not really worth that much to them. They want the warehouse.
It's not worth the literal space it takes up in the factory.
That basically what they sometimes conclude. Hopefully nowadays they don't do. But we don't know. We won't know until the next round of people from Games Workshop leave and can talk about it in interviews. And I imagine that they get people to sign much more serious
NDAs,
non-disclosure agreements now than they used to. So
that's some pretty ironclad stuff.
Yeah. But anyway, that I thought that was just an interesting end. Hopefully, Games Workshop has changed from that, and So
sunshine and fairies.
Exactly. But there we go. I think we'll sign off there.
Bye.